The morning started like any other. Claire poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, black, and one with cream and sugar for her husband. She placed it on the counter like she had every day for the past 30 years. No thank you, no eye contact, just the shuffle of footsteps fading down the hallway as he grabbed his keys and left for the office. She stood there for a moment, fingers wrapped around the warm mug, staring at the half-empty spot at the breakfast bar where he used to sit and tell her about his day. Used to. Now their conversations were more like calendar alerts. What time is the plumber coming? Did you pay the insurance? Claire could still remember the version of him who made her laugh so hard she snorted wine at dinner. She hadn't seen that man in years. The kids were gone now, grown, good-hearted, and off chasing their lives in cities far away. The house was quiet, too quiet. Claire had always thought she'd welcome the peace, but no one tells you to how loud silence can be when the laughter moves out and routine becomes your only companion. Every Wednesday, she met Sarah for coffee at the little cafe 2 blocks from her house. It was their ritual, their safe space, a place where they'd spent decades sharing secrets, fears, heartbreaks, and inside jokes no one else would understand. Sarah knew everything, had held Claire's hand through miscarriages, mother-in-law drama, and the loss of Claire's father. She was the sister Claire never had, the one person who never made her feel invisible. But lately, Sarah had started cancelling. "Work emergency," she'd text. Or, "just swamped. Rain check." The excuses came more often, and when they did meet, Sarah seemed distracted, restless, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. Claire told herself it was nothing. Everyone goes through seasons. Maybe Sarah was just tired. Maybe her husband was working late too. Maybe life had simply caught up to both of them. But still, there was something. A feeling Claire couldn't shake, a distance she couldn't name. That morning, as she rinsed the 2 mugs in the sink, Claire looked out the window at the early spring light pouring through the garden. The daffodils were blooming, early, bold, as if trying to remind her that something beautiful could still push through hard earth. She didn't know yet that her entire life was about to split in 2. She didn't know that trust, the kind that takes decades to build, could shatter in a single afternoon. But the cracks had already started. She just hadn't looked closely enough. Have you ever ignored your instincts because you didn't want the truth to be real? Have you ever convinced yourself silence was just a phase, not a sign? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what Claire discovers when the people closest to her begin to pull away, for a reason she never saw coming. Claire hadn't meant to see it. She wasn't snooping. She wasn't suspicious. She was just looking for the grocery list, the one her husband always scribbled on the back of receipts and left in the kitchen junk drawer. Only this time, it wasn't a receipt she pulled out. It was his phone, buzzing 1 new message. Claire wasn't the type to read her husband's texts, but something in her chest fluttered, like a quiet alarm going off without permission. Her thumb hovered, her breath caught. She tapped. The message lit up the screen in clean, cruel letters. "Last night was perfect. Still thinking about the way you touched my hair." At first, Claire blinked, confused. Then she saw the name, Sarah, her best friend's name. The name she'd written on birthday cards since she was 21. The name that felt like home. Claire sat down. Hard. She scrolled. Message after message. Photos. Inside jokes. Plans. Hotel. Confirmations. 18 months. They'd been sneaking around for 18 months. Claire pressed the phone to her chest, as if the weight of it could keep her from unraveling. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She was numb, frozen in the middle of her own kitchen, watching her reflection in the glass door like she was someone else. Someone naive. Someone disposable. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the phone. She got up, slowly, and drove. She didn't even know where she was going until she pulled into the parking lot of the little Italian restaurant on the other side of town. It was early, just past lunch, and there they were, at a corner table tucked into the window, laughing like it was the most natural thing in the world. His hand on Sarah's wrist, her head tilted back in a laugh Claire knew by heart. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the ease of it, like they'd never had to hide who they were around each other. Like Claire had been the inconvenience all along. She didn't go in. She just sat in the car, hand trembling over the steering wheel, watching her entire life get rewritten through the windshield. When she got home, she waited, and when her husband walked in the door, tossing his keys in the same ceramic bowl she'd made in a pottery class 2 decades ago, she stood up and said one word. Why? He didn't even pretend to be surprised, just looked at her with that tired guilt of someone who'd run out of lies. It just happened, he said. We didn't mean for it to. Claire let out a laugh that sounded nothing like herself. You've been in a secret relationship for 1.5 years. That doesn't just happen, that's a choice, every single day. His face crumpled. I didn't want to hurt you. But you did, she said. And you didn't stop. He tried to reach for her hand, but she stepped back. She didn't need comfort from the man who had stolen everything sacred and handed it to someone she called sister. Later that night, Sarah called. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to hear. Whatever excuse or apology was waiting on the other end, because in that moment, sitting alone in her bedroom, while the world she'd built crumbled around her, she finally understood. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come with blood or violence. Sometimes it comes with the quiet sting of 2 people you loved most, loving each other behind your back. And that wound, that one goes deepest of all. Claire couldn't eat. She tried. A spoonful of yogurt, a bite of toast. But everything tasted like cardboard and betrayal. Her stomach, once so used to preparing meals for 4, then 3, then 2, had now closed, up like a fist. The house felt colder, bigger, as if the walls themselves knew what had happened and were pulling away from her out of shame. She didn't open the curtains that week, didn't water the succulents on the windowsill. The only sound in the house was the steady mechanical hum of the refrigerator and the occasional soft ding of another missed call. Her daughter, Maggie, flew home the moment she heard. Claire hadn't wanted her to come, but she was glad when she did. Maggie walked in the door and didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around her mother, tight, like she was trying to hold all the shattered pieces together. I'm so sorry, Mom, she whispered into Claire's shoulder. I had no idea. None of us did. Claire nodded, but her face stayed blank. She didn't want to be strong or brave or dignified. She didn't want to be anything. She just wanted to wake up in a world where her best friend hadn't kissed her husband. But that world was gone. Her son came the next day. He didn't hug her. He just sat with her on the back porch in silence for nearly an hour, sipping iced tea and staring at the backyard like it might offer answers. Finally, he said, You didn't deserve this. Claire blinked. Then why do I feel like I did? He looked at her, eyes burning. Because you're kind, and people like you always try to find the blame in themselves. But this isn't your fault. It should have made her feel better. It didn't. She spent the nights in a fog, lying awake, rewinding memories, replaying every conversation with Sarah, looking for signs. Every late meeting her husband claimed to have, Every time she was too tired to notice, too trusting to question, she wanted to believe she'd been blind. But a small, painful voice inside her whispered, "You saw it. You just didn't want to know." Her therapist, Dr. Lynn, a woman with calm eyes and a voice like a lake, told her this was normal. "You're in survival mode," she said gently. "You've experienced a double trauma. You don't have to do anything right now except breathe." But even that felt like work. Claire sat in group therapy the following week, surrounded by women in all stages of grief and fury. Some were angry, some were numb. One woman cried openly, mascara painting her cheeks like war paint. Claire didn't speak until someone asked, "When did you first feel like something was wrong?" And without even thinking, Claire whispered, "When I stopped." Laughing, it was true. Her laughter used to come easily, fully, from the belly. But sometime over the last few years it had turned into polite chuckles, empty smiles. She'd folded herself smaller and smaller, making room for everyone else's joy. And now there was no space left for her own. After the session, a woman named Elena approached her. Probably mid-60s with silver curls and eyes that had clearly cried oceans, but still sparkled somehow. "I know that feeling," Elena said. "The folding, the shrinking. But let me tell you, grief is a thief, yes, but sometimes it clears the house so you can start decorating again." Claire managed the tiniest of smiles. It didn't reach her eyes, but it was a start. She still didn't know what her next step would be. Still felt like she was floating through a version of her life that didn't quite fit anymore. But that night, as she sat on the floor of her closet, hugging an old sweater that still smelled like Sarah's perfume, something shifted. Claire didn't cry. She got angry, and for the first time since her world cracked open, she whispered 3 words she hadn't said aloud in years. "What about me?" Claire's anger started as a quiet ember. It didn't roar or blaze. It simmered, low, steady, almost polite. But it was there, burning beneath her skin, warming the parts of her that had gone numb. It came in waves, when she brushed her teeth and saw only one toothbrush in the cup. When she passed the cafe where she and Sarah used to laugh like teenagers. When she opened a drawer and found a pair of cufflinks she had saved up for weeks to buy him on their anniversary. He had worn those cufflinks to dinner with Sarah. The ember flared. One afternoon she wandered into the basement to find an old box of winter coats for donation. As she rummaged through the shelves, her fingers brushed something familiar. A worn leather strap, cool and cracked. She pulled it free. Her camera. The Canon AE1 she'd bought in her 20s with the first reel. Paycheck from her first real job. Claire gasped softly, as if she'd just bumped into an old friend in a place she least expected. The weight of the camera in her hands was grounding. Real. Hers. She sat on the basement floor and turned it over slowly, her thumb brushing against the scratched surface, her breath catching as a memory surfaced. A photo she once took of a little girl dancing in the rain, barefoot, fearless. That girl had been Claire, and she hadn't picked up the camera in over 20 years. She opened a nearby box labeled MISC and found old prints, photos of places she'd traveled, faces she'd captured, a younger version of herself with eyes full of mischief and a lens pointed toward the world. She stared at them for a long time, and then she cried. Not the silent, empty tears of grief, but the guttural, full-bodied sobs of someone mourning, not just a betrayal, but a self long abandoned. Later that evening she made herself tea, turned on the porch light and called him. He answered, on the second ring. His voice was cautious, as if he expected pleading or softness. "I need you to come get your things." Claire said evenly. By Friday. Silence. You're serious? He finally asked. I'm not angry anymore, she said. I'm done. He started to respond, but she ended the call before he could explain, beg, or lie. Then she picked up her phone and messaged Sarah. Do not contact me again. We are no longer friends. I release you. No insults, no drama. Just truth. It was freeing, in a way she hadn't expected. The next morning, Claire walked into the garage and cleared out the old shelves. She found nails, a hammer, a shelf bracket, and hung her favorite black and white photo from decades ago. One she had taken of herself in a mirror, smiling with a confidence she'd forgotten she once had. She called a local community college that afternoon and signed up for an advanced photography workshop. The woman on the phone asked if she was a beginner. No, Claire replied, her voice steady. I'm just returning. That night, for the first time in months, she slept deeply. No dreams, no nightmares, just rest. Something had shifted. Not everything was fixed, not yet, but the ember was now afire. And Claire? She was done folding, done apologizing for taking up space. She wasn't looking back anymore. Have you ever rediscovered a piece of yourself you thought was lost for good? A dream, a passion, a part of your soul? Let me know in the comments. And if Claire's story is speaking to something inside you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens when she finally steps fully into her own light. Claire didn't make the decision in a single, dramatic moment. It came slowly, quietly, like water soaking into dry ground. Over the course of a week, maybe 2. A series of mornings waking up and realizing she no longer wanted to live in a house that held his voice in the walls. A collection of nights where she stood at the sink, washing a single plate, and thought, this is not the life I choose anymore. So she chose differently. She met with a lawyer, a kind woman named Judith with sharp eyes and a velvet voice, who explained things clearly, respectfully, as if Claire's story wasn't shocking or pitiful. It was simply a fact, a transition. Claire cried only once during the meeting when Judith asked if she wanted to fight for the house. I don't want the house, Claire whispered. I want peace. They filed the divorce papers that same week, telling her husband was easier than she expected. He blinked a few times, ran a hand through his graying hair and said, Are you sure? I'm sure, Claire said. He didn't beg, didn't yell. Maybe he'd already left her long before he ever touched Sarah's hand. Claire gave herself 2 weeks to sort through what she wanted to keep. She packed with intention. Not like someone escaping, but like someone reclaiming. The wedding china stayed. So did the antique dresser she'd inherited from his mother. Claire left behind anything that didn't feel like hers. She bought a small condo near the coast, with wide windows and white walls, and space for her to breathe. It had a balcony that faced west, and every evening the light spilled into her new living room in long golden stripes. She set up a folding table near the window and turned it into a temporary photo workspace. Camera gear on one side, a vision board on the other. Post-it notes littered the wall with words like movement, truth, women in transition, start again. She bought a corkboard and pinned up 5 of her old photographs. Then, beside them, she taped a blank sheet of paper and wrote in bold, ink, faces of starting over. A portrait series. Every day she took a step. Some were big, signing up for the gallery walk downtown, reaching out to her old photography professor. Some were small, buying fresh flowers for her kitchen, walking barefoot across her new floors, watching the ocean alone without sadness. She had moments of doubt too, nights when the loneliness crept in, when her fingers hovered over Sarah's contact in her phone, just to see it. Mornings when she reached across the bed out of habit and felt only cold sheets. But the difference now was, Claire stayed with those feelings. She didn't run from them. She let them pass like weather, and they always did. One afternoon she was sitting on her balcony, sipping tea, when a text came through. It was from her daughter. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You look more like yourself than I've ever seen." Claire smiled, her throat tightening. She opened her phone's camera and flipped it to selfie mode. Not to post, not to edit, just to look. There she was, softer around the eyes, a few more lines on the forehead. But something sharper too, clearer. She didn't need to erase the years to find herself again. She just needed to stop hiding, and now she was visible, fully, fiercely, finally. The first time Claire took her camera out into the world again, she felt like an imposter. It was a sunny Saturday morning. She slipped the strap over her shoulder, double-checked the lens cap, and walked through the weekend farmer's market like she used to back in her 30s. Before kids, before responsibilities drowned out her curiosity. She was nervous at first, keeping her camera close to her chest, like a secret. But then she saw her first subject, a woman in her 60s, laughing with a child who was clearly not her own. The woman's silver hair glinted in the sunlight. Her joy was unfiltered, unguarded. Claire lifted the camera. Click! The sound startled her, but then it thrilled her. She spent the next hour capturing real moments. A teenage boy holding flowers behind his back, an older couple dancing to the music, of a street violinist, a vendor wiping his brow with the back of a tattooed hand. None of it posed, all of it true. When she got home, she uploaded the photos and sat still as they filled the screen one by one. It wasn't just that they were technically good, sharp focus, beautiful light. It was that they felt like something. She printed 3 of them and pinned them on her corkboard next to her old work. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own story. She felt like the narrator. Claire signed up for a local exhibition called Midlife Lens, a small show at a nonprofit art gallery, celebrating female photographers over 50. She hesitated before submitting her work, then added a title, Faces of Starting Over, the curator emailed her within a week. "Claire, your work moved us. We'd love to feature the full series." That night, Claire stood on her balcony, glass of wine in hand, and watched the sun bleed into the sea. She thought about how much she'd once feared this version of her life. Alone, starting over, no husband, no best friend, no roadmap. But now, the air didn't feel empty. It felt wide open. She began building new routines, not just to fill time, but to fill herself. Morning yoga on the deck, afternoon walks with her neighbor, Linda, who had also been through a quiet divorce. A photography class every Thursday night, where, to Claire's surprise, she wasn't the oldest person in the room, but she was the most fearless. And then there was David. They met at the gallery opening. He was admiring one of her portraits, a black and white photo of a woman standing barefoot in a field of tall grass. "This one," he said. "She looks like she just remembered she's allowed to take up space." Claire smiled. She did. They talked for a while, about art and grief and starting over at inconvenient ages. He was kind, steady, a recent widower who didn't seem interested in fixing or saving anyone. Just listening. They met again. And again. Coffee turned into walks, walks into dinners, dinners into long conversations about the strange beauty of being alive, even after everything falls apart. Claire didn't label it, didn't rush it. But one night, as she locked her door and turned out the lights, she realized something surprising. She was no longer waiting for someone to come home. She already was home, right there, in her skin, in her breath, in her new, sacred, unbreakable life. And she had built it, brick by brick, with her pain, with her lens, with her fire, and most of all, with her choice to reclaim every piece of herself that had been given away too easily. She hadn't just survived the betrayal, she had turned it into light. The invitation arrived in the mail, nestled between bills and a catalog she hadn't subscribed to in years. Claire recognized the handwriting instantly. Her daughter's soft cursive, slightly slanted to the right. Inside was a thick cream envelope with rose gold edges and a single line embossed on the front. "You are lovingly invited to celebrate the wedding of Maggie and Elias." Claire smiled, her fingers brushing the paper as if it were delicate silk. Her baby girl was getting married. A new chapter. A beginning born from love, not betrayal. But then the smile faded, replaced by a slow, cold twinge of reality. Of course, he'd be there. And of course, so would Sarah. Claire had known this day would come, the inevitable moment when she'd share space with her past. She'd rehearsed it in her head, imagined different scenarios, every one of them ending in awkwardness or pain. But when the day finally arrived, something unexpected happened. She felt calm. She wore a soft navy gown, simple and elegant, with a silver cuff on her wrist, and her camera tucked gently into her tote. Not to play photographer, just in case she wanted to capture a moment for herself. The ceremony was held in a sunlit garden filled with peonies and eucalyptus. Claire sat in the front row, her hand held tightly by David, who looked at her with quiet encouragement and a warmth that expected nothing. When her daughter walked down the aisle, Claire wept, but not from sadness, from joy, from the quiet astonishment that life could still give her something pure. After the ceremony, there were hugs, champagne, laughter. Then she saw them, her ex-husband, a little older now, a little smaller than she remembered, and beside him, Sarah, wearing a pale blush dress and an expression Claire couldn't quite read. They approached slowly. Claire stayed seated beneath a tree, a glass of water in her hand, legs crossed, posture relaxed. "Hi," he said softly. Claire nodded. "Hello." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Just a half smile, a flicker of regret maybe, or memory. Claire looked at them both, not with rage, not with forgiveness, but with something deeper. Detachment. Freedom. "I hope you're both well," she said, meaning it in the most neutral sense of the word. "We are," her ex-husband replied. "Good." Claire stood, brushing a speck of lint from her skirt. "Take care." She walked away without looking back. Later that evening, under string lights and soft jazz music, Claire found herself dancing with Maggie. Her daughter beamed. "I'm so glad you came, Mom." "There was never a question," Claire said. "You are my heart." Then, in a quiet corner of the dance floor, David extended his hand with a grin. "Can I steal one dance before the night ends?" Claire laughed and placed her hand in his. "Only if you promise not to spin me too fast." As they danced, she looked up at the stars. She thought about how far she'd come, not just from heartbreak, but from the version of herself who would have shrunk in the presence of those who broke her. She had faced them, looked them in the eye, and walked away, lighter. Because when you know your worth, closure doesn't come from their apology. It comes from your own peace. 2 years later, on a crisp October morning, Claire stood in the center of a bright, white-walled gallery in downtown Portland. Her name, Claire Bennett, was etched in silver lettering above the exhibit's entrance. Below it, the title of her latest show, Reclaiming Me, a portrait of starting over. She had expected a few close friends, maybe some fellow artists, a curious stranger or two. But the gallery was full, buzzing with quiet voices and reverent footsteps. Women stood in front of the photographs, with hands over their hearts. Some wept. Others simply stared. Each portrait told a story. A 64-year-old woman learning to swim for the first time. A recent widow smiling in her late husband's flannel shirt. A cancer survivor with no hair, but the boldest, most defiant eyes Claire had ever captured. They weren't just faces. They were proof. Proof that women didn't expire at 40. That healing wasn't linear. That beginnings weren't reserved for the young. And somewhere between the third and fourth row of portraits stood David, holding 2 paper cups of hot cider, waiting patiently for her to finish greeting a woman who had driven in from Seattle just to see Claire's work. "You didn't tell me it would be this moving," he whispered as he handed her the cup. Claire smiled, her eyes misty. "I didn't know it would be either." That night, back home in her cozy condo, she sat on the couch in her softest sweater, flipping through her journal. On the last page, she had written, "I lost a husband, I lost a friend, but I found something far more sacred. I found me." She closed the journal and set it on the shelf beside her camera. In the quiet that followed, Claire stood and opened the balcony door. The wind carried in the scent of sea salt and change. Hope. Her rescue dog, now older, slower, but still loyal, curled up at her feet. Claire breathed in deeply, then sat down at her desk, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began to map out her next project. A travel series. Title, A Life of My Own. Because this time she wasn't rebuilding around anyone. Else, she was building forward, building free, and finally, joyfully, building for herself. And if Claire's journey touched something inside you, if you've ever had to rebuild from nothing, to rediscover who you were after someone tried to erase you, then I want to hear from you. Have you ever started over after betrayal? What gave you the strength? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. If you love this story, drop a 2 in the comments. If it left you thinking for hours, give it a 7. And don't forget, subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories for more true-to-life tales of women rising from the ashes with grace, grit, and glory. Your story matters. And your comeback? It's just beginning.